Welcome to IndoctriNation, a weekly conversation series about protecting yourself from systems of control. I'm your host, Rachel Bernstein.
Hello, everyone. It is so nice to be able to introduce the guest for today, Jon Atack. Jon Atack is one of my favorite people to speak with. I always learn a lot. I find myself wanting to go in so many different directions with the conversation. So we are going to be making arrangements to speak more often and record our conversations so that you can hear all the different directions we get to go in. Jon Atack is a leading expert on authoritarian cult groups, as well as a best-selling author. He has worked with hundreds of former members and has lectured and written extensively in a career spanning 4 decades. Jon's book, Opening Our Minds, shows how cultic behaviors are established throughout society, and it sheds light on the methods used in pseudo-religions, therapy, commercial cults, as well as modern slavery. He also shows that these methods succeed because of failures in our education system. And I love talking to Jon about our education system and the problems with it and the limitations of it. You can find all of Jon's work on his website, jonatack.co.uk, and make sure to subscribe to Jon's YouTube channel. Here's Jon now. It is delightful to be speaking to Jon Atack today. We're just jumping right in. We haven't had the usual sort of time for pleasantry, so I'm sure we'll do that as we're talking. I want to know, since the last time you were on the show, how things have been going and how is life treating you, Jon?
Well, life's not treating me well enough. I don't have a Rolls Royce.
Aww.
I don't have a palace. You know, it's just so unfair, isn't it? No, I'm great, thank you. Fairly happy, all in all. Actually, the last 4 months now, I've been deeply immersed in research for a book which draws parallels between Scientology, which some of our viewers may have heard of, and the Nazis. The book will be called If Scientology Ruled the World. And it was a thought experiment to say, well, what would happen if David Miscavige became president of the known universe? How would that play out? What would happen? For 40 years now, I've been very curious about the magical thinking, the occult thinking of the Nazis. And I read, there are some silly nonsense books out there. The Morning of the Magicians by Paul Zimberger, which is an absolute nonsense. A guy called Ravenscroft, I think, The Spear of Destiny. And it really didn't help having these things out there. But over the years, some serious historians have given attention to this and discovered that, in fact, the Tool Society, which is the occult society, the anti-Semitic occult society, which formed the Nazi Party, it's that simple. They started it. They had a group called the Germanenorden, which was secret. They had the Tool Society, which was public. And they were the founders of the Nazi Party. They recruited Hitler. So you've got all of this bizarre occult thinking. And I thought, well, I need to trace that back. And I did. And it traces back to a guy called Ignatius Donnelly. Ignatius Donnelly was a pseudoscientist in the 19th century who put forward the idea that the Aryan people had lived on the lost continent of Atlantis. And that idea was picked up by Madame Blavatsky, who is, the godmother of all cults, pretty much. So many groups come out of her. And in a book called The Secret Doctrine, published in 1888, she put forward this idea that there had been 5 root races, 5 different species of intelligent life on this planet. The first of them came here 250 million years ago. Who'd have thought? They were intangible beings who became tangible. I'm not really sure how they did that. She then progresses through a series of other intelligent beings none of whom have left any trace. 250 million years, they tied it up after themselves so completely.
They tied it up. Right.
No waste products. And then about 2.5 million years ago, and this is what the Nazis believed. And I think neo-Nazis today have got no idea what they mean when they say they're Aryans. So about 2.5 million years ago, the Aryan people, who are the children of the gods, pretty obviously, and had superpowers, came down to Earth 2.5 million years ago, encased in shards of ice. And they were doubtless blonde and blue-eyed. They were here 500,000 years before the earliest hominid fossils of Homo erectus. So, and again, they were very tidy people. They've left absolutely no trace. But they had a little bit of a, you could call it an aberration, that they're beautiful, blonde-haired, blue-eyed people, but they like the look of orang-utans. And they thought, well, we better have sex with them.
Right. Sure.
And that's where the Northern Europeans come from. That's where the Aryan peoples come from, the miscegenation, the interbreeding. So I'm going, well, they may have been very handsome, these people, but they weren't very clever. Also that kind of interspecies breeding wouldn't work. Out of this gets caught up with pan-Germanism, the idea of, the Germans being superior in some way. And of course, genetically, we're only talking about people who speak German. The Austrians, the Germans, and the British and the Scandinavians, who are held by Hitler and co. to be Aryans. Genetically, we're part, human beings are all part of the same thing. The curious thing is that in terms of DNA, the differences between us are what makes us the color we are. And that's it. Everything else about us, we're 99.9% identical. But our skin color, our hair color, our eye color are genetically determined. There's nothing else in it. And, so I went off and read about modern genetics and about the eugenics programs that were going on. Of course, the Germans, the Action T4 program, where they killed a huge amount of people who were disabled, which followed on, I'm afraid to say, from American programs of the same type, where massive sterilization programs, about 70,000 people before Hitler came to power. And this incredible idea that, you can breed racehorses, let's breed human beings. So they've got this mad idea of this Aryan race. And along comes this guy Himmler, and he sets up what is called the Lebensborn. And the idea is that the Aryans used to have superpowers. Very much the sort of things that Ron Hubbard promises to Scientologists. In fact, the Aryans had naturally. But because they had strange sexual predilections, they'd lost their powers, their electron powers. What Himmler was trying to do, and the numbers vary, somewhere between 8,000 and 20,000 children were born in the Lebensborn programs in Norway and in Germany and in various of the German settlements in Eastern Europe. And the idea was that they were going to breed back superpowers. So this was their kind of equivalent to the operating Thetan levels.
Right, right.
And this program actually happened. There's a massive court case in Norway where Lebensborn children sued the Norwegian government for all of the prejudice that they had suffered from. And a settlement was made by the Norwegian government accepting this. In fact, one of the members of ABBA is a Lebensborn child. There you go.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, my.
So it was taking that and kind of going, well, okay, if Scientology ruled, what are the policies of Scientology? How would this be applied? And at first, I started writing it, and at first I'm sort of going, Tony Ortega's never going to approve of this. Tony's going to look at this and he's going to say, John, no, this is too far. You've gone too far. I'm very happy to say that Tony's seen the first half dozen chapters and has actually come back with a very complimentary statement. Whether he'll go for the whole book, we don't know. But he's my way of testing something. If, can't get bullshit past Tony, it just can't be done.
Right.
So that's thrown me into all of this, understanding that these occult ideas, which have proliferated so dreadfully in our time, and the way in which ideas, I started from a statement that's often attributed wrongly to Voltaire. People who believe absurdities may commit atrocities. He said something vaguely like it. But that idea, if you believe absurd things, you'll feel justified in performing atrocities. And of course, with the German Nazis, we certainly saw that. And that's the idea I wanted to explore. Along the way, the book sort of separated out because I wrote far too much about the Nazis and the development of occultism with them. And I'm going, this is too much for this book. So that's gone off into another book. To explain Scientology, I thought, well, I'll tell my own story. One of the strange things about Scientology, because it's not allowed to change. So the Scientology bridge that I did right the way up into the operating Thetan levels, up to operating Thetan level 5 to achieve superpowers, the same procedures are still used. I left 40 years ago, but the same procedures are still used. We did a thing, Getting Clear, in 2015 in Toronto. While we were there, Steve Hassan, Christian Shirko, and Chris Shelton, in I think his first public appearance, we deconstructed a few of Scientology's techniques. But I don't think anybody's really systematically tried to go, well, this is why this is dangerous. This is what is being done. This is what you're complying with. So I wrote 3 chapters about, doing the Scientology bridge. And I went, there's far too much material here. This is not the right book. So I put that to one side. And I think I now have 5 books that have come out of this. And I'm still working on a book about Charles Manson and his profound involvement with Scientology, which nobody has explored. There are more than 50 books about him. And I have documents that are not public, which show that Scientology was fully aware that he had spent 14 months training. And you kind of go, so if we said that somebody had spent 14 months having military training, we think that was relevant, wouldn't we? If they'd spent 14 months studying courses in hypnotism, we'd think that was relevant. But people have been willing to just push that aside, I think partly because they're worried that Scientology might come after them with its fair game law. And so we have all of these books that don't actually tell you what Manson was doing to his followers. So I'm still working on that. I've potentially got a documentary going with that. But apart from that, I'm really not doing anything,
From that.
Well, apart from listening to quite a lot of Sibelius and Mahler and things like that. But, we all have to do that. Yeah, it was last night when we saw the 5th and the 7th symphonies by Sibelius, which was good. It's a good thing to do with time, generally.
It's lovely. And I'm sure you're doing your gardening and tending.
I'm not actually. It's been a very bad year for the garden. We don't know what happened, but all over the UK, we've had failure with, I usually grow about 40 tomato plants. Not one of them flowered this year.
Oh my. So going back, to moving our conversation outside of tomatoes, even though they are fascinating.
They are fascinating, yeah.
Yeah. Of course, I'm going to, along with many other people, I'm going to care very deeply about people really understanding about the Nazis and the Nazi Party. But I also have been hearing about a lot of people taking these ice baths and things for health. And I know so much of the science came out of human experiments during
in the concentration camps, yes.
Holocaust and concentration camps. I mean, I remember learning about that when I was young. There are things of stuff of nightmares for when you're a young Jewish child growing up in the world, hearing these stories. But if we can maybe even start there about what people are prone to believe and how they can be convinced that something that did exist didn't, but that something that didn't exist did. I find that fascinating and disturbing.
Me too. And that was really the beginning of my quest, that when I left Scientology in 1983, I left because I believed. I left because I thought Hubbard had gone. And I was at the very middle of the independent movement in Europe for a few months. I'd not been a staff member. I'd not been humiliated and abused. I'm the only person I know, having spoken with more than 1,000 people who are involved in Scientology. I'm the only person I can confidently say, no, I wasn't humiliated and abused. Most people were. But a few months after I left, I stopped believing. That had never happened before. I didn't believe in the organization. I knew the organization was fascistic. That was pretty obvious. I thought the ridiculous prices that were charged, when I got involved in 74, it was, you pay £6 an hour, which is about $10 an hour. That went up 20 times over to £120 an hour by the time I left. So that was obviously ridiculous. But when I would say to somebody, well, look, here Hubbard says he was crippled and blinded at the end of World War II. And here he says on July the 25th, 1945, so a couple of weeks before the war ended, 3 weeks before it ended, he's in Hollywood and he beat up 3 petty officers. It's him saying both of these things. One of them's not true, or neither of them is true. And I remember saying that to somebody, and she looked at me and she said, oh, I had 2 bodies. It was like, how many bodies did he have in all, I wonder, and one of them was crippled and blinded and one wasn't. And, so that finding some random excuse, I then found that probably 80 or 90% of the people I spoke to, they were convinced. That ultimately leads to the feelings of knowing, the sense of certainty. When I was about 17, I spent a couple of hours having what I thought was a quite pleasant conversation with a born-again Bible basher. And he backed away from me at the end of the conversation. I don't know what I'd done to scare him so much. Didn't raise my voice or anything. And he said, I don't understand the Bible, but I know it's all true. Now, he and I had a different understanding of the word know and the word understand, because as far as I'm concerned, that's impossible. You can't know that something's completely true unless you understand it. But it is how we live. We have all sorts of cherished beliefs that we're certain of. This is the way it has to be. This is the way it is. William James talked about it. He called it noesis. Yuval Noah, in his brilliant work, has pulled out some of the strands of this. And you have to get past that. You have to, Holocaust denial is, that's the one for me as well. My father was at the liberation of Belsen. He didn't talk about it, but he did have nightmares for 10 years afterwards. There is film, as you say, there's a film called A Painful Reminder, which shows footage of Belsen. And the guy who filmed it said that he did opened out pan shots to show that they weren't making anything up. There were no special effects. Some years ago, I got into conversation with a good friend who suddenly told me that he didn't believe that the Holocaust had happened. He was driving me to give a talk in London to the Skeptics Society, who were very skeptical, I must say. They slept through the talk. They just had a lovely lunch and they used to have an after-dinner speak. But whatever. I had the drive up there and the drive back with my friend, and he said, there's no Holocaust. And by the time we got back, he was saying, well, yeah, it's probably an exaggeration of the numbers, which I've heard so many times since. So I said, well, how many people do you think it was? And he said, well, maybe 2 million. I said, well, that's pretty bad, isn't it? The next weekend, I had a party at my house, and about 2 a.m, I came down, found him in the kitchen, having pushed some poor person into the corner, saying, of course, the Holocaust didn't happen. And you're kind of going, look, this is something for which there are more than 100,000 statements from people who are involved. And that isn't just people who were inmates in the camps. It's certainly not just people who were Jewish. A lot of Romani, a lot of Slavs were murdered in the camps as well. But it's not only the victims of it. There are statements. So I went away. Another friend years later denied it. And I spent 3 days looking through the Nuremberg trial transcripts to find something to say, well, here's evidence. And you've got Rudolf Höss, who was the first commandant of Auschwitz. And he's asked on the stand, so you executed 1.25 million people. And he replies, I executed and exterminated. And his deputy backs him up. And you're going, these people weren't tortured. They're bragging. They're boasting about what they did. And then you had the testimony of German military personnel of all ranks that support this. And she's going, well, as you say, they're willing to believe in Atlantis, which is a fairy story told by Plato, possibly about a tsunami that covered Crete at some point. Who knows? but there's no other evidence for it at all. Nothing. And Plato is saying it happened, I think, 900 years before he's writing. So you're kind of going, well, that's... And yet, as you say, you bring people, you can sit them in the room with someone who can show them the number tattooed on their arm, and they'll still say, well, I don't believe it, you're exaggerating. And they'll go off and, talk about the guy who took scrapings from the gas chambers at Auschwitz and there was no cyanide, so there was no Zyklon B used. And you're going, well, yeah, but the Russians actually bulldozed Auschwitz and it was rebuilt. So we don't know that you got the right bricks. And cyanide actually deteriorates very rapidly in contact with the atmosphere. So even if we try to be scientific with these people, Leuchter, that was the name of the guy, he spent his life trying to design an electric chair. He had no qualifications to do that, and none of his designs was ever used. But that was his hobby, was how do you kill people efficiently? So you get this, and what we have to do is help people to think better, help people to consider evidence, and which I know you've spent a lifetime. I've spent a lifetime doing this, getting through to kids particularly, how you assess evidence, how you tell whether news is fake or not, and what authorities you can trust. I have an example of this, which is something that's been annoying me all year. There's a psychiatrist called Nasir Ghaemi, and he's at Tufts, or he was at Tufts, professor. He's affiliated with Harvard Medical School, and he wrote a book called A First-Rate Madness. And the idea is that in times of crisis, crazy people are best. And he gives 8 examples of people who and he's an expert on mood disorders, so I'm surprised that he includes people who are depressed, which is not a psychotic illness, along with people who have bipolar, which is a psychotic illness in some of its forms. So he takes, his first example is William Tecumseh Sherman. This is an example of a great man who was bipolar, quite evidently, looking at his correspondence. And he's suggesting that the man who burned Savannah and Atlanta, the man who ran, he doesn't even mention that he was head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So the Plains Wars, the attempt at exterminating the Lakota and the Cheyenne, was run by this guy. And he's saying he was a great man. Now, the reason I bring this up is surely he's an authority. He's a professor of psychiatry at Tufts, Ivy League. He's at Harvard Medical School. He's even got a degree in history. And you're kind of going, so your first set of tests should be, does this person have the authority to say what they're saying?
Mm-hmm. Right.
But even when we've got through that, there are certain other tests we have to do. In his case, that test was to look at the factual basis of what he's saying. And he says that Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister at the time of the declaration of war on Germany in 1939, was unaware of the dangers of Nazism. And you kind of go, well, I beg to differ, having read some of Chamberlain's diaries. In 1934, he was the guy proposing to the British government that we had to rearm. In 1935, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, he wrote the rearmament bill. And the people who later attacked him, particularly Michael Foot, who was a member of the Labour Party, a book was written after he died called The Guilty Men, blaming him for Britain not joining the war after Munich in 1938. And you're kind of going, well, here's something that a guy with a degree in history ought to know. At the time of Munich, Britain had 12 high-altitude fighters, 12 Hawker Hurricanes. The German Luftwaffe would have destroyed Britain if war had been declared at that point. Chamberlain, I think quite rightly, said that declaring it over Poland was still going to be really difficult. He was the only member of the War Cabinet to vote against it. But to then say that, he wasn't aware of this, he didn't care about this, when he was the man who was actually promoting it. So we need to check our authorities, and that includes me. I expect people to go away from this conversation and say, well, John said that Himmler was German. Was he really German? Fact-checking has to be something that we do personally, and something which, it's so difficult now, isn't it, with the internet having so much misinformation and disinformation. So learning those skills, teaching people those skills, some of which, as you know, my book, Opening Our Minds, was an exploration of these things. How do you determine whether somebody's predatory? Which I think is a first. What's the advantage they may gain by persuading me to buy their secondhand car or religion or whatever it is they're trying to sell me? What are the methods of propaganda? How do we get people to become fervent? And how do we separate out as individuals our actual knowledge from our feelings of knowing? We're all susceptible to it, of course. We all have beliefs.
We're all susceptible, and now with the algorithms, we're targeted. And so how do you get away from it? And you don't know that suddenly the headline that's coming across your computer or your phone is something you were targeted with. And you think, oh, it's something that everyone must have been informed about if it's news. It's interesting. There was a study done where they paid participants, college age participants, to watch CNN for a month, who were sort of typically more conservative in their thinking, and then those who are more progressive to watch Fox News for a month, and to see then what would happen. And most of them changed their party affiliation to be in line with the news that they were watching. And it's alarming to see how easy, all too easy that is to do. And also just taking in, as Dr. Margaret Singer talks about, the evidence of your senses, that if you are not making yourself available to your senses, taking in what's around you, it's very disturbing and also interesting to me to see why that is. Why is it that we are prone to, let's say, believing, like with the story about L. Ron Hubbard, that he had two bodies, and that's sort of this automatic response. Like, of course, our brain wants to make sense of things, and that's the answer. That people then might just chime in with the word Atlantis or astral projection or something that answers the question, that keeps them from having this very uncomfortable cognitive dissonance. But why is it that you go to the things that are magical? Why is it that you go to the things that are invisible rather than the proven? And I also wanted to say, it's now reminding me of a time that I visited a group called the Kabbalah Learning Center, started by this man, Rabbi Berg. And it's not part of regular Jewish mysticism, mainline Kabbalah, as they say, even though Kabbalah is mysticism, and so it's not really considered mainstream in general. But the Kabbalah Learning Center, right, is the way he ran it, the way he wanted to run it. And that makes it different from, I think, Kabbalah that has credentials. But I remember going to one of their introductory courses because I just wanted to see what people were learning. And there were many things that were very, very disturbing, like if you find out a child is being abused, you do not need to go to their aid because that is a correction. That's a karmic correction, and other things that chilled me to the bone. But there was this one piece that they talked about where they asked the question, have you ever been deceived by information that you took in? Like you heard a sound and you thought it was something, but it turned out to be something else. Or you saw something and maybe it was kind of a figment of your imagination, or it turned out as you got closer to not be that. Have your senses ever betrayed you? Raise your hand. Everyone raised their hand. And then they said, that means you cannot trust them. All the information that you bring in through your senses, everything you read, everything you kind of know through your senses is 100% false now, they've decided. And so the only thing that you can trust is what we tell you, what we tell you it is, what we tell you it looks like, what we tell you it sounds like, what we tell you the definition is. And so you have, I think, in so many of these places, people who then just are in this consistent kind of dissociative and dependent state. Okay, I'm not going to connect with the things happening around me. I'm not going to look at the Holocaust footage and take it in. I'm going to wait for you, who now I I see someone who I can trust with information to guide me, to tell me what is. And they can say anything, because if what they're giving you is something that you can't see or hear or touch or feel or taste, then they can say anything. And it is frightening.
Absolutely. And it is authoritarianism. It is the essential problem that there are people who believe they are gods and should be worshipped and followed, not naming any names.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people who, because of their upbringing, because of their education, feel that they're not competent to make a choice, and they latch on to. I mean, with Hitler, the thing that's evident is, in a time of tremendous chaos, which of course the Weimar Republic in Germany, actually they were just about starting to get control of things again when Hitler took over, sadly. But you have this time of great uncertainty, and somebody comes along and says, I know the answers, I know what to do. The authoritarian comes along. And one of the most startling pieces of information about the Nazis is 45% of medical doctors joined the Nazi Party. Now, if you look at modern China, I think only 4% of people are in the Communist Party there. So these doctors chose to do this. And then were, of course, many of them willing to kill their patients. Our friend Christian Sherko talks about internal reality control. And as children, we're born without it. You know, you're born with nothing. And what should happen is that by the time you become adult, which is somewhere around the age of 75 or something, I think, by the time you become adult, you should be able to be responsible for your own thoughts and your own beliefs. And unfortunately, we don't teach this at all. What my friend Ari Chalef calls intelligent disobedience. That we don't teach children to ask questions, to say no, to say, no, I don't want to do that. And so we develop authoritarianism. We develop this dependency. And it goes either way. I like Benjamin Franklin's idea of drawing a line down a piece of paper and putting pros one side, cons the other side. One of my ways of testing people's subjection to authority is to say, all right, well, you want to vote for this person, you want to go with this person, put down all of the pros and all of the cons, and then give them a points value, as Franklin said, add everything up and see where you go. But the thing I can guarantee is that when somebody really is an authoritarian believer, only one side of the page will have anything on it. And if you find yourself in that situation where everything is black and white, everything is right or wrong, you know, as the people at the Kabbalah Center would, you know, have said, that if the reason that Jews died during the Holocaust is because they had not practiced the Zohar, they had not followed this thing, and you kind of go, what a horrific idea that, you know, you're somehow wrong because you don't wear a little bit of red string around your wrist or something like that. It also means we have to be willing to challenge our own assumptions and our own beliefs. And when we find ourselves getting heated in discussion, I mean, when this friend of mine said to me he didn't believe in the Holocaust, he did point out that I started getting a little bit annoyed. It's like, and I'm one of these people that talks about rational and calm discussion. But to me, the thought was so offensive and the proof so obvious that you immediately do go to the, how could you be so stupid? And it isn't usually stupidity. It's usually that somebody has used their intelligence to buttress their stupidity, which we are all so incredibly capable of doing. So, I mean, John Stuart Mill On Liberty, which I think is a basic text that all kids should read. It's not difficult to read. It's very straightforward. It's very short. Written in the 1850s. And there he is saying, even when a fool suggests something to you for the third time, hear them out. You could be wrong. So that capacity. And Jensenko, The Brainwashing of My Dad, to exemplify what happens when your news feed is imbalanced. I was talking with a Muslim friend yesterday, and he says he watches Al Jazeera. That's the news channel he watches. And I think that's not a bad idea at all. I haven't watched it a lot recently, but whenever anything is happening in the Middle East, I want to see what they say. But then he said, I won't watch the BBC. And I'm sort of, well, okay, there are problems with any news source, but it's not controlled by Murdoch. And that's a definite advantage. It's not, forgive me, it's not Fox News. The BBC does have a reputation, and I think having two sources is quite. So if I'm looking at something in the Middle East, it's good for me to see what the BBC say about it and what Al Jazeera say about it. I'm not going to watch Russia Today. I must admit, nothing will. I did used to, actually, when before the Ukraine war, it was on our channels here, but I did watch it mainly for amusement. I must, seeing how far Larry King had sunk that he was willing to appear on this awful channel. And that led me off into reading Peter Pomerantsev's books, of his work in Russia Today and in the Russian media, which is just incredible, seeing the state control and how Putin was able, to convince people of these bizarre ideas. You can see Vox Pop that are being done in Russia at the moment, and people are going, yes, we're getting rid of the Nazis in Ukraine. And you go, you do realize that the premier of Ukraine is Jewish, don't you? He may not be the best person in the world, but I don't think he's a Nazi. I don't think that's an appropriate word.
There's so many people who don't realize that what they're getting is this kind of false information. And now I'm wondering also, with all of this stuff that we get that's so muddled, there's also still this kind of need for some people, to feel that purity or being pure is the best thing, and that there, it's reminding me of a story I heard of white supremacists going by in a pickup truck past an indigenous people's, I think it was a powwow that was in Montana, and they yelled out to the Native Americans,
"Go home.
Go home.
I am home. You go home."
Right? And they're like, really? They were a little frightened. The kids were frightened, but the adults were laughing like, oh, I'm sorry. Oh, so maybe this isn't our home, but how about 4 feet to the left? Okay, that's where my family's been from for 1,000 years. You're right. Okay, I'll go home. Let me just step over here. And where are you all from? But just that they're not seen as pure somehow, but the ones who have come to this country later on are somehow pure. I don't know what. What is that about, this need for purity, even with going back to where this conversation started with Scientology and the occult and the Nazis and the need to be this sort of pure, core, clear, without any faults. And sometimes that also is being in a weakened state when you are I think of, don't mean to liken humans to dogs, but here I go. I know I've had dogs my whole life, and some of the purebreds who I rescued are actually not as healthy as the ones who had been bred with other dogs that didn't have hip, dysplasia and didn't have heart issues. And they had found a way to sort of make them healthier and stronger because they weren't, quote unquote, pure. So what is that about? Why does that matter to people to this degree, like to the degree of the Nazis?
It is astonishing, isn't it? But I mean, looking at a breed like, say, the King Charles Spaniel, where they've been bred so their brain case is not big enough. And so they'll have neurological problems later on. Or pugs and bulldogs, they can't breathe properly because they've been bred in this way. The same is true for racehorses. The same is true for anything that's closely interbred. In human beings, we have the Habsburg chin or the Bourbon chin, where we can see from portraits of Spanish and Austrian monarchs that their chins just grew bigger and bigger as they interbred. And you're kind of going, well, so we know that mongrelization as a process actually makes us stronger, that bringing together cultures, and it does work on an ethnic level as well. Many of the great cultural innovations, say something like Impressionism in painting and in music as well, that there was a lot of Japanese influence coming in. Because the Japanese had just been savaged in the 1850s to make them open up to the world, and the ukiyo-e prints were coming out, and Oriental music was coming along. It reinvigorated the West. It allowed changes. The same is true in philosophy. That in the 19th century, Schopenhauer reads the Upanishads, and that gives a whole new, view. And I'm not a particular fan of Schopenhauer. I do quite like the Upanishads, having said that. But there is no, or or diet. It's like cultural appropriation. Should the Indians be allowed to use chilies in their food? Because they came from Mexico, you know? So we should really, and purity would all take us all back to that. And of course, genetically, for human beings, you can't get there because you've got genetic makeup from all over the place. We see one racist after another take the saliva test and they find out they're part Turkish, they're part Russian, they're part Scottish, whatever. There are no pure human beings. And our strength comes from our ability to pick up new ideas and take on new things. There was no golden age. What the Hitlerites believed, what Himmler taught, was that the Aryan people, all civilization and culture comes from the Aryans, that they had been the overlords in Egypt, in Babylon, in India. There is absolutely nothing to support this idea whatsoever.
No.
And that they'd had a perfect society until the Romans came along and gave them Christianity. And you're going, well, the Romans weren't Christians when they started going against the Germania. And people start building these things which are, they're castles in the sand. They're fairy stories. And yeah, that demand for purity, which of course Robert J. Lifton lists as one of the 8 deadly sins of thought reform. It is so easy to persuade people they ought to be this. Half of European Jewry was destroyed under Hitler. About 6 million people out of perhaps 11 million in Europe at that time. For no reason whatsoever. There's nothing rational in it. And so we have to learn to live together somehow, which means being able to put aside our prejudices. It means, when I talk about something that the English did in the past, historically, I don't say we won the Battle of Waterloo. I say they won the Battle of Waterloo, So I associate myself. Charlie Chaplin, when he was asked about patriotism, said he was a patriot of the whole world. And I think that feeling of going, well, I'm part of humanity, becomes going forward with the catastrophe that we're creating. I believe that environmentalism is vital, but as long as we're fighting wars, when you look at what a war does in terms of the waste of resources and the devastation of the environment, until we stop fighting wars, we're not going to be able to deal with our environmental problems. And we're not going to stop fighting wars until we understand the problems of authoritarianism, the problems of propaganda, the problems of influence, the stuff, the raw material that you and I deal with every day of our lives, how people are persuaded to do things that are against their own best interests. And, how we can restrain that in some way and make people understand that they're hurting themselves in the long run.
Right. In the long run. So that's an interesting thing, because that's a whole other subject about kind of myopic thinking. How do we help people see things in the long run? How do we help them go from short range vision to long range vision and see that the decisions that are being made now, even in terms of the environment, are going to have these long-term impacts? But I think people are they're all too easily manipulated to be wrapped up in the moment of now. What do we need right now in order to feel safe? And that's, I think, why fear-mongering works so well. It keeps people in the now. How can they make sure to protect their families today? I think, it's like with Scientology, having this us versus them, being sort of militant about so many things, that we need to protect ourselves and we need to somehow be superior to other people who are going to try to potentially take something away from us. It's hard. It's like people who are in abusive relationships. They're just trying to make it through the day, trying to make it through the minute. And people say, how come you didn't leave? I didn't have the luxury. I was so caught up in surviving,
Where was it going to go? And
right?
And what was it going to do if he came after me? And
exactly right. And if there are children involved in whatever else. And so I feel like cults drum up the same, and Nazism drums up the same. Like these are the threats right now. And this is what we're going to be able to protect you from right now. And it doesn't even give you a moment's peace where you can sit back and say, but wait a minute, the decisions that I make now to what I adhere to and what I believe are going to have long-term consequences, not only for the world, but for me. And let me look at them. And I think that's why so many controllers keep people so consumed, so they can't have the long-range vision.
Absolutely. And we live in a society that has more going on in terms of influence. I read that we're subjected to 100,000 words a day on average, which when you look at it, might call itself news, it might call itself advertising, but it's all an attempt at some level to try and get us to buy an idea or a product or a lifestyle. I mean, a lot of my study over the last 4 decades has been of advertising because I don't see any difference. Influence is influence. And so seeing in the 1950s, the executives of ExxonMobil, whatever they were at the time, there was this secret meeting that leaked. And the PR guy at it said, and this is about 1954, the PR guy said, we have to get to the point where our product is viewed in the same way that religion is viewed. We have to have, and out of this comes the concept of brand loyalty. So as a Pepsi study I read where they interviewed this guy and he said, I look at the red, white and blue of the can and it makes me think of my country. And it's like, yeah. And then you drink the crap that's in there, it makes you ill. But that, getting people to be patriotic, to serve their nation, to serve something that's an abstract idea. Now, humanity is not an abstract idea. We are all very real. Changing that perception, but as you say, it's a matter of the short-termism. If you do have to get through the day, you have to get through the day, and that's tough. But having some sense of ethical responsibility, as a human being, behaving in a friendly way towards other people, though being aware that there are people who will exploit you if you are friendly, and finding that balance, being willing to consult your intuition, that when something feels wrong, being willing to consult it, but then not acting on your intuition, going away and reasoning and thinking about it. One of the things that fascinated me about Madame Blavatsky and Carl Gustav Jung, who I've also been looking into recently, Jung was really into alchemy. He had a library of 5,000 books, and he had the most incredible collection of medieval books on alchemy because he believed that the images in them were images from the collective unconscious. He also believed, by the way, that the Aryan collective unconscious, this is Jung, was different from the Semitic collective unconscious. He said this. So he believes that these images are real. And you kind of go, well, when I look at a Hieronymus Bosch painting, I'm not going, these are real things that must have happened somewhere. I'm going, the top of a fish and two human legs coming out of it. This is imaginary. And looking at Blavatsky, looking at Ron Hubbard or Aleister Crowley, who's the link between Blavatsky and Hubbard, they imagine things and then they decide they must be true, they must be real. So being able to differentiate what we would like to be from what actually is, and having objectives, because of course sometimes the objectives are hateful. The idea that when Barbarossa was launched against Russia and Eastern Europe, Himmler issued an order saying they wanted to kill 30 million people because that's how many people they wanted to replace. You have white supremacists talking about replacement theory. Well, that's where it came from. And they were successful in that. That's the horrific thought. At least 20 million Russians died, probably more than that. And they were clearing the land, just like you chop down trees to put in, every hospital, every mental hospital they came to, they killed all of the patients so that there'd be beds for their soldiers. So they made themselves into the Übermensch, the master race, the supermen, the operating thetans in Scientology terms, the elite, which is an idea that just keeps coming back. My group is elect. My group is superior. When we go back to the Gnostic ideas around early Christianity, we find this concept of the electoi, that when you have transcended and you know the passwords that will take you through the planets, which will lead you to God after you die. Oh, giving a secret away. You are a member of the electoi, and you can look down on rabble, hoi polloi like me, and not have to have any concern. And changing that, elevating it to the point where we have a positive regard for all human life, even the lives of psychopaths, even the lives of serial killers. But having said that, for their sake and ours, the best thing is to Hannibal Lecter them, lock them up so they can't do harm, but not treat them, as vermin, in the same way that people who perform genocide treat everyone else. So having compassion and respect for human life, and having humility, but being willing to question your own assumptions, being willing to think further, and most of all, being willing to do exactly what we've just been doing, which is to have a discussion, to talk about things, to air our views.
It's really quite incredible. I know we need to finish, and wow, my goodness gracious, it says so much about the need to learn history, the need to learn where words are coming from, the idea of replacement. I think people have no idea that, that what they're hearkening back to horrors and genocidal kinds of actions. Some might learn that and might not be bothered by it, but I would hope to think many would be bothered. And it's important to know where these ideas come from and what the original agenda for them was and where they can lead. So thank you for
It's been a great pleasure
for teaching us so much today. And I hope to talk to you again soon. Where can people find you and your work and online, your books, all of it? Go for it.
My books are available at all good booksellers, but mainly Amazon, I'm afraid. If you just stick Jon Atack into a search engine or into Amazon, then you'll find me. I have a YouTube channel where I talked with my friend Eddie Stratton, who's an expert on the Holocaust. So there's 500 or so videos, but in there there's a video on Holocaust denial. When I went back to Edwin afterwards and said, could he give me reference texts, he listed 23 books about the Holocaust, not about Nazis, but about the Holocaust, to show that he really has done his job. So that's Jon Atack Family and Friends on YouTube. I have, webpage, the usual things we have, Facebook and Instagram and TwitX, and I think we've moved to Blue Sky. And as the man who wrote the book, A Piece of Blue Sky, I'm very glad to see they've named this thing after me.
Yes, that's lovely. It's very, very nice of them to do that for you.
It is.
Anyway, very good, very important, actually, conversation today. And I really, really appreciate the time and all the research that you do, making things make more sense, but also seeing the continuity of things and the connection between things, which is very important to know.
Yeah, and hopefully stimulating in people the same urge that I have, that I didn't do well at school. School didn't do well for me. I dropped out when I was 17. There you go. It's just the wrong environment for me. And I realized that what they were doing was killing curiosity. And that's why I couldn't get on in that environment. I'm nearly 70 years old. I can't keep up with my fascination for the world. And that is the thing I would really like to encourage in people, to find out. Follow your bliss is Joseph Campbell's way, but follow your, go in the direction you want to go, understand things, try and make sense of them, and help other people do the same if you can.
Lovely. Thank you. And important. Thank you, Jon. As always, I hope to talk to you again soon.
Yes, that would be great.
Wonderful.
Thanks a lot, Rachel.
Okay, my pleasure. Take care.
You too.
One more thing before you go. Thank you, Jon, for taking us into very insightful places and also some dark places that are very important to look at. It is really difficult to see how much repeats itself throughout history and will continue to repeat itself into our future. When I think of all the people now who think of themselves as experts, who are really not, the ones who just have a megaphone out there and are speaking louder than everyone else, or people like influencers, internet influencers, who I think, by and large, not everyone, but by and large, they don't have as a value and as a strength and as a focus that they need to understand history. I think they start in the present time and then work towards the future. This is what's important now. This is how you're supposed to look now. This is how you're supposed to dress now. This is what you're supposed to wear now. This is what you're supposed to eat. I'm a coach and I'm going to help you with getting healthy right this minute. I'm going to be your life coach and I'm going to teach you what's important for you to know and get and achieve and manifest for your future. But where's the history? If influencers really had a sense of history, I think they might not actually jump in where they jump in, kind of just in the present. I think a lot of people now are fed information that is kind of where narcissists begin, usually or in the present time. They think of their life in the present and into the future, but they don't think about the past. They don't think about past hurts. They don't want to gain insight from past behaviors. They don't even want to look at how what they might be doing is dangerous now, because we can see from history where it was dangerous before. I don't know if they care, but I care. Jon cares. And I think those of you who listen to the show also care about this sense of history. It is so important to understand how history repeats itself. It is so important to understand the concept that there's nothing new under the sun. It is crucial for navigating not only the present, but preparing for the future. What you get to do when you see the past and then the present and the future is you can anticipate recurring patterns. It's very good to understand recurring patterns, because how else do you have a good predictor? How else then can you allow for preparation and how to respond or how to avoid what you see happening or what you see is going to happen? It also helps you avoid past mistakes, knowing where things went awry, where things kind of went south before, where things got dangerous, where people may have needed information that could have kept them safe, but they didn't have access to it or they weren't open to it. When you know that, then you know what information is important for you to know now or to share with the population or to share with your loved ones so that people have a sense of how to keep themselves safer. It also just helps you build wisdom that's connected. When you have the big picture, that's when you can have wisdom, I think. It also helps you with adaptability, looking at what happened in the past. If it's something that you don't want to have repeat itself, how do you then adapt to what's happening now so that you can change the trajectory of your own life, of your loved one's life, of society's life, potentially? It's also important, and this is not important to everyone, I realize, but it's important to have perspective. I think when you realize there's nothing new under the sun, you connect the struggles and achievements to the broader human experience. And when you're connected to the broader human experience, I think you can't help then but have some wisdom, but also it fosters humility. Like you are part of a larger system. You are part of history. You are part of something bigger than you. You're part of a movement, or you're going to be affected by a movement that might feel like a huge wave crashing over you. That's perspective. That, I think, does foster humility. And then It fosters critical thinking, very important to me, as you all know. You can then explore these recurring themes in history and then challenge assumptions, help other people challenge assumptions, and getting kind of the encouragement to have critical analysis of current events and trends. I think it's also good to understand the role of human nature and how people respond to certain kinds of leadership, how people respond to certain kinds of rhetoric, how far too easy it is to stoke up this torch and pitchfork way of responding to ideas, how easy it is to other people, how easy it is to pit people against each other. It also is important, I think, when you have a sense of history, that you have a sense of caution, to see what you really need to see, to be careful, to know, again, how to prevent certain dangers in your own life. But also, I think, and maybe this might feel like being too much of a Pollyanna, but I think there is kind of an empowerment to it, an optimism to it. Being able to say, okay, I get it. I think I can see where this is going. I think I can see why. Helps you also not to feel so overwhelmed by it, so baffled by it, so shocked by it. And instead, I think really does give you the power to take steps you need to take, if there are steps that you can take. What I do with information that I think is important for people to know is I like to teach about it. And that's why I like this forum of being able to have a podcast. Let's look at things. Let's look at this trend. Let's look at where we saw it before. Let's look at what it can look like now, how to notice it. I want to be able to keep people as safe as possible in certain contexts. And I know Jon cares about the same. He wants to illuminate a lot for a lot of people. Right now, there's a lot happening, though, at a very fast pace, and it can feel overwhelming, and it can cause a lot of people I've talked to feel immobilized, to feel overwhelmed. And so maybe the place you start is just to understand, just to be able to see where things happened before and where they might happen again, and what part you want to play in that, to prevent it, to evade it, to understand it. Thank you very much, Jon. Looking forward to talking to you again, and I'll talk to you all next week.
Thank you very much for listening. Please support IndoctriNation on Patreon at patreon.com/indoctrination. Be sure to give us a follow on our social media. Find us on Facebook and Instagram using @Indoctrination Podcast. And for Twitter, find us at @_indoctrination. We love hearing from you too. So send us an email at indoctrinationshow@gmail.com. And for more updates on the show, visit our website at www.podpage.com/indoctrination.